Hi, welcome to Smith and Grezzy. We've got two very, very interesting guests with us this week, Andy Cook and Andrew Baker. So I'm going to pass you over to Sandy to introduce them both, and we'll go from there.
Well, you and I talked, Grezzy, a while ago about getting interesting people on, and some of them are quite obvious. You know, we've had old banding colleagues of ours on, such as Alan Morrison and Kevin Crawford and things. But I thought these two guys were worth people having a listen to. Both Andrew Baker and Andy Cook. I first came across them on the old Mouthpiece forum, which was in the days of steam-driven internet. There used to be some good discussions on there, and when it got a bit, not even heated, just the discussion was sort of going all over the place. These two guys, to me, seemed to come on and sort of come up with some really good suggestions and ideas. And the thing that sort of impressed me was that they could see the bigger picture and everything. So I just thought, how interesting would it be to get these two guys on? Because I think what you will get from them is a considered, balanced, thoughtful, intelligent response and opinion on things. So that's why I contacted both of them and thought, let's get them on. And let's just have an open discussion and see where it takes us.
We might not agree with it, Sandy.
No, that's fine. There's no problem with that. But I just think it'd be a good idea to get... I know these two guys think deeply about all of this. And I just thought it'd be good to get some considered opinions from the likes of them. So I thought we would start with... we have been discussing quite a lot about... The question we gave out was what constitutes a championship section standard band. We did that a few podcasts ago, and we had a few suggestions from us about what that means, what it means in this country, what it means abroad. And we were asking for responses to our email address and basically just messaging us and things. And Andy Cook came back, and Andy, you gave us not a counter argument. It was just something that maybe we hadn't discussed properly in full. So I thought we would use that to sort of kick off and let you explain, because we were saying about there are basically 12 championship section bands in Norway, and we have about 80. And we tried to get around the whys and wherefores of that, and the how we can maybe get the standard up a bit. But you came back with a few ideas, so I'll let you take over and explain the sort of stuff that you were talking about.
Yeah, it was mostly just that you set me thinking about it, and the definition of a championship section band and such like, because with the greatest respect, when you guys think about a championship section band, you're thinking about it from the perspective that you played at, because both of you put the effort and you worked really hard. You both played at fantastic levels. I mean, how many Europeans was it, Grezzy? It was quite a few. And Sandy with a long period at Black Dyke and then at Grimethorpe and that sort of thing as well. But the fact of the matter is that about 4/5 of championship section banding in the UK, as things now, if we accept that 80 championship section bands is the number we have, 4/5 of championship section banding isn't done at that level. It's middling sort of championship players, like more sort of like myself. So maybe we have a slightly different perspective on it. I'm not saying I disagreed with some of the things you were saying. I just think there's a couple of counterpoints to be made. So we talk about Norway. They've got 12 bands in their championship section over there. Well, Norway is a country of 5.4 million people. There's 67 million people in the UK. So is it really that unreasonable to assume that we'd be able to put 80 championship section bands together across the regions that we have, if that's what we're working towards? So, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that we're at the standard, because, let's face it, continental Europe, the investment in the arts and the ability of people to learn music over there, it's somewhere ahead of where we are in Britain. It's not been prioritised for a lot of reasons, and we all know about that. So if we're talking about potentially getting down to a system where we can have an own choice and a set work as part of the national championship, the point that you made was that we've got to reduce the numbers because the time just isn't there to do that in the Albert Hall. So if you get down to 12 bands, the obvious way to do that is, at the moment, you've got the 4 pre-qualifiers, and then you've got 2 bands come from each region, and that makes up your 20 bands at London. So if you went to just one band rather than your two bands coming through your regional championships, then you're down to your 12 bands and you've got the time to do that. But the question then is, does that really improve the standard? Because if we compare, I don't know about you guys, I always think of the British Open as the top level of banding there is in the UK, because everybody who's in there has earned a place there. They're all there by merit.
Yeah.
If you look at the makeup of the Open, there are 6 bands from Yorkshire in it. There's 4 from the Northwest. There's 3 from Wales, 2 from Scotland, 2 from the West of England. There's none from the North of England. There's none from the London Southern Counties. And there's none from the Midlands. And obviously there's Trez Etoile as the European representative this year, so that makes up your 18 bands. So whenever you're tied to a regional structure, even if you cut down to 12 bands, what you're actually doing is cutting down the participation of the bands who were a stronger region. So at the moment, we know how difficult it is in Yorkshire anyway, with the competition that there is at the top. But if I'm looking at it from the point of view, I do my banding in the Northwest at the moment, the way the setup is at the moment with the pre-qualification, are my band realistically going to beat Foden's for a place at the national finals? Absolutely not, because Foden's are such a fantastic band. I mean, it's inspiring to hear them play. You hear them play, you think that's the standard we want to be at. That's what we're working towards. But if they're going to London, the prize for them that they want is the trophy. For a lot of us who spend our time in the other 80% of championship section banding, the prize isn't the trophy. The prize is just the stage. We're trying to get there. We're trying to be part of that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to maybe sneak through on the coattails of some of the other bands, that's a real motivating factor for people like myself.
Right. See, that I thought we had sort of talked about that slightly in as much as, and you're right about the makeup of the British Open bands, about this lack of bands from London and the Northeast. They're to all intents and purposes, they're the weaker areas. And we thought about if you had more pre-qualifiers, that would give the stronger bands from the stronger regions more representation. Because I get what you're saying. There are bands in Yorkshire and Lancashire that would probably quite readily compete in the top 10 at London. You know, bands that generally miss out. But we did that over 10 years and found there was no bands at all from some of these regions that appeared in the top 6 of London over a 10-year period. So does that not sort of address that? We are giving the stronger, we're not stopping people qualifying, but it's up to them then to prove their worth to keep going. Does that make sense? I don't know.
It kind of does make sense, but again, it depends on you. To me, it depends on your perception of a championship section band. There's a clear and obvious divide in most sections. I mean, I know we don't necessarily like to talk about it because we're all trying to be those bands and we're all trying to take it to those bands. But a lot of the time, in many of our regions around here, there's a real drop-off in the standard of the bands, in the sort of bands that I play for, the sort of player I am, as opposed to the bands that are routinely qualifying and are pushing for a national championship.
Yeah.
So that's maybe something to factor in.
Does that point... Go on, Andy.
Sorry, I think I think some of the aim of what we were looking at, Andy, is giving these bands like the bands you play for the ability to know what the attainment is and drive for it. And also, the biggest thing for me is that as an organiser at these things, they want all the best bands there. They don't want what the so-called cup of tea bands. I don't wish to be disrespectful to them bands. I've played for some, but you know, it's just driving the standard up that we were talking about. I feel, is that right, Sandy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, Andy, the way you're talking, it's almost like you're acknowledging the fact that there is a split in the championship section, isn't there? It's already there.
Definitely.
So are we not talking about then that for the benefit of the bands in what, I don't know, I hate this word, you know, elite or whatever you want to call it, the universal, something, Hyper League or something. We know who those bands are. What I was thinking was that for the bands such as yourselves, would you not be better off competing against bands of your own standard to get real success playing test pieces that are really accessible to you? I mean, what's your thoughts on the sort of test pieces? Andrew, you can come in on this as well, about the sort of general standard of the test pieces that for the top section. I mean, are they too difficult? Because that's another thing I've heard, actually, from someone I'm quite close to. Was it a wedding? Oh no, not a wedding. It was a funeral. The other one. Recently, and there was a band playing, and they are in the top section, and they're probably one of the sort of bands that you're just talking about, Andy. And they were complaining that the regional area top section pieces are far too difficult. Now, does that not point to the fact that that band's in the wrong place? I don't know. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to chip in on a couple of things that Andy said just before I get to that, if I can. And one of those things is that I think the problem we've got is that there is no clear understanding from anybody of what the National Championships is for.
Okay.
Is it to find the best band in Great Britain, or is it to drive up the standard of banding generally? Because we're sort of having two conversations here about what it's for. Now, at the minute, it is to find the best band in Great Britain, and it doesn't do that very well, because in any given year, at least one of the bands in Yorkshire that would be a contender for honours in the Albert Hall gets left at home.
Okay.
So I don't think it works as a way of finding the best band in Great Britain. Actually, that's what the Open does, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Albeit there's some foreign contenders at the Open.
It's kind of like the... sorry to interrupt. It's kind of like the football analogy, as I sort of explain it to people, is that the Open is like the league, because everybody who's there is there on merit. And we all know how tough it is to get out of the Grand Shield and get into the Open.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very difficult competition. But there is that sort of slightly more open element about the National Championship because of the regional structure. And it's a little bit more like the FA Cup in that respect, that however illusory it is, that you can get and you can challenge some of the big boys if you find your way through from a pre-qualification spot, an extra one that's added to your region or something like that. It may be illusory that you can go and compete, but the illusion is still there. Whereas
it is illusory,
not so much with the Open.
You look at the two major competitions in this country. The last time I would argue that a left field contender won the Nationals is 19 years ago when Leyland won it. And the last time a left field contender won the Open is getting on for 30 years ago when Marple won it.
It is.
Since then, it's basically been 6 bands have shared it.
That's quite true.
So, this argument that there's not an elite division or a hyper league or whatever you want to call it, doesn't hold up on paper, really.
No, it doesn't.
Because there is, because 6 bands essentially have shared all the major honours between them in this country for the last 2.5 decades. That's the question I think we need to address. Is there a way of breaking that? It's not a monopoly because there's 6 bands, but there used to be 10 or 12 bands that you would say had a crack at a major title in any given year, and that's not the case anymore.
So Andrew, you mentioned about the Nationals not really being fit for purpose. I know that's a strong phrase, and that
It's a bit harsh, but yeah,
it is a bit, and I don't mean to be. It's just that. How would you reorganize it?
Depends what the aim of it is. If the aim of it is to find the best band in Great Britain, then I'd do exactly what was previously suggested, which is you'd have 4 qualifiers plus 1 from each region, and you'd make them play 2 test pieces, set piece and own choice, like they do in Europe and they do in Switzerland and they do in Norway.
And that way, Andrew, they'd be better prepared to enter the European. To get an experience of doing it. That was my thought.
Correct. Yeah, but if the argument then is that the Nationals is actually about motivating bands that are perhaps not in that top elite division of 6 to get somewhere near, then you do different things.
and I'm not entirely sure what they are. But the problem with doing those different things is that they can't happen while the contest is privately owned as a limited company that needs to make a profit to stay in business. Capital Promotions need the best bands in the country to be at the Albert Hall every year, and they need to play pieces that are going to get bums on seats. So forget commissioning brand new pieces from modern. It's no good saying, well, we'll have a brand new piece by Thomas Hades, for example, who's never, to my knowledge, written a brass band piece, but is one of the biggest figures in contemporary music, in classical music at the minute in Britain. Because people would go, well, we don't know who he is. We're not sure we're going to like it. We'll go to the Open instead, or we'll go to Brass in Concert instead.
Yeah.
And then that hits Capital Promotions funds, and yet we all know how much the Albert Hall costs, or, we should do. It costs a fortune, in case anybody's wondering. And the income from the Albert Hall not only pays for the nationals to be in the Albert Hall, it also, to a certain extent, has to subsidise the lower section nationals, which has never washed its face in the last 20 years financially.
No.
So
Right.
There's a conversation to be had about what do we want the national championships to do before we decide how we're going to fix it. The problem is that we don't actually know what we want it to do. Do we want it to encourage multiple bands, or do we want it to find the best? Because it sort of does neither very well at the minute. And that's not a criticism, by the way. I've met Phil Morris a few times, and I think his art is very much in the right place. I know he's a committed bander of many years standing, and the Nationals wouldn't exist without him. It would have gone bust and failed when the Federation made a pig's ear of it. He rescued it, and he deserves banding's thanks and appreciation for doing that.
Yeah.
There are, I think, some things that could be done to decide what it's for in order to then...
The clue's in the title, isn't it? National Brass Band Championships of Great Britain. I think so. That's why I'm thinking it's to be finding the absolute best band in Great Britain.
It is, but then I worry about the bands that Andy's talking about. The bands. See, I mean, Milnrow, I don't know if you were there, Andy, but they've qualified on the odd occasion, haven't they? They were in the Open for a bit, and they
have. That's sort of a bit before my time. I've come in.
So, I mean, they'd be one of those bands that have sort of, pushed their way in, and then, they've had the odd appearances here and there. I don't know. Did they get to the Albert Hall once or twice, maybe?
They have done a couple of occasions.
Yeah, they have, yeah.
So, they're the sort of bands who I would be trying to help more. I just think it's like when Andrew's saying about the we all know there's an elite section. Everybody knows who they are. We can all name the top 5. They're pretty bog standard. We know who they are. The next 5 to 10, 6 to 10 rather. We'd probably agree on 3 or 4 of them. 11 to 15 would start to disagree. And then 16 to 20 would have proper arguments about who those were. There aren't that many really top-notch bands, are there? And so what I would be looking at doing is those bands who are out with that, how do we improve those bands? And I'm not sure that, like Andrew says, that we're helping them much, because some of the test pieces that we are choosing hard test pieces, and that's of necessity, because Andrew said Philip Morris wants the top bands at the Albert Hall to sell tickets. It's quite simple. Are those test pieces, like that band that I just talked about, who were complaining that the test pieces are all too hard? They're patently in the wrong place, or they should be playing a test piece that's going to improve them. Do we need another section?
Well, that was already tried with Section 1. I mean, when Section 1 was created, the idea was that it was preparing bands for their time in the championship section to bridge the gap. But we've still got the gap there. I mean, what we're not talking about is that while ever the national championship is tied to a regional model, and some regions are notably stronger than others, as we discussed a minute ago, while the makeup of the British Open, we can argue that these bands are potentially in the wrong place if the test pieces are landing in front of them. But the fact is, those bands are still going to be there while ever you're tied to a regional qualification model, because they're still going to come through as the winner of the area.
But I don't know how frustrating must it be for a band like Rothwell, right? good band, but they struggle because of the Black Dykes and the Brighouses of the world.
Yeah, because Yorkshire's such a tough region to
Yeah, I mean,
conquer.
it used to be said that Yorkshire and Lancashire were the top two. I think Yorkshire is quite markedly the strongest now. Is it time? Here's a left field idea. Is it trying to ditch the regions and come up with some other model for both so that it more mirrors the? I don't know. I don't even know how you would start to do that.
I
Mirrors
think
the
it's
British Open.
I think it's time to ditch regions for the championship section. I think they work well for the lower sections 1 to 4. But I think that there needs to be a different system of finding qualifiers for the finals in the championship section when there is such a disparity between regions. A couple of years, I kind of had the honour of conducting Harrogate Band, who were technically, at the time, championship section in the North of England region. And we worked on contest music, and in the end, we couldn't go because of COVID, and we had some issues. But you know, we had to work really hard on contest music. Now, it's notoriously a tricky piece, but it's not. You look at the notes; it's not technically that hard. You know, it's not like people had to go away and spend 6 months with their arbon just to get their fingers moving fast enough to play contest music. It was very much more a kind of musical challenge. But then you start looking at some of the pieces that have, you know, some of the kind of European blockbusters that are still technically championship section pieces. And I know we wouldn't have played them. We wouldn't have got anywhere near. But we were a championship section. You know, we'd have had a good crack at whatever was put in front of us. But you know, there are bands like that in every section, more in some areas than there are in others, that will have a fight on their hands to get a performance on the stage on the day, and they're competing against the Black Dykes and the Fodens of the world. It seems odd.
Yeah, that's exactly what Duncan Beckley said to us, Andrew, about his band Horbury. Same sort of thing. They'll have a go at it. And something they can have a go at it. But it's interesting you say about contest music, because that was picked deliberate, obviously. And this idea of technical and musical, and I hate this idea that, and I know you get it, Andrew. I know it's not a technical sort of fest as like a sort of Year of the Dragon type piece. It's not millions of notes or something like that. To me, technical is controlling your instrument and all that slow playing as well. But bandsmen, bands people tend to see technique as fast stuff, musicality as slow stuff, which I think is just misses the point totally. And we need to get away from that as well. And I think a lot of these test pieces now just seem to be full of, I hate to call it technique, just fast rubbish, that doesn't say anything musically.
Well, that comes back to the question that you actually asked me, and then I didn't answer, which is are the pieces too hard? And one example that springs to mind immediately is Sand and Stars, the open piece last year,
right?
Which not last year, was it last year? I think it was.
Yeah, it was.
Anyway, yeah, it was. Now there are bits in that where I don't care how good an adjudicate you are. You might have an ear like Pierre Boulez, but you do not know what is going on in that piece, because there are bits where there's 5s and 6s and 7s all against each other. You don't know if somebody's playing that right or not.
No,
you just
absolutely.
don't. So it's not even a case of whether the piece is too hard for the bands to play. It's whether the piece is so unnecessarily complex in its notation and its scoring that it becomes impossible to see whether a band's playing it correctly or not.
Do you know what?
Then you think, well, what's the point? And
yeah.
I've got to put my hands up and say I've got an interest in this one, but The World Rejoicing by Edward Gregson, which was a couple of years previously, entirely different, because it wasn't tricky, but it wasn't that hard in terms of just purely flying the fingers around.
But it was so transparent.
It was so transparent in the scoring that there was no hiding place. There was nowhere where you could just waffle and waggle the valves, and nobody would actually know whether you were playing it right or not. At every point in that piece, it was obvious whether you were playing the right notes in the right place with care and control. And I just think, much as I've liked Thierry's music sometimes, I thought Sand and Stars didn't do that at all. And that is one of the problems with this kind of European blockbuster, mad 20-minute piece full of fast semi-quavers all the time. You don't know whether they're playing it right or not. I don't care how good your ear is, unless you're Pierre Boulez, and even then, I think you're going to struggle.
Who can bluff the most convincingly, you suspect, in a lot of cases. Andy, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I sat and listened to several bands on Sand and Stars. I was down the Open. I'd certainly echo the points that Andy said about the way that it's scored, because the scoring is so thick all the way through it, and there's so many lines that cross over each other, that one of the things I noticed straight away, I mean, I hadn't read a score until the day because I wasn't playing, I was listening, but a key thing that every conductor will have had to do when they're looking down that score is think, okay, these are the lines that are important. These are the lines the adjudicator will be listening for. Yeah. These are the ones that I need to push into the background. And it really doesn't matter what happens with those. And if you're ever reaching a point with a piece like that, I mean, a test piece is supposed to be one of the things that you've got to get the detail out of it. You've got to get every last bit of it. And you've got to convince the adjudicators that you know what you're doing and that you're playing everything that there is on the score because they've got the score in front of them. But if there's bits of that score that no matter what you do, they're just not going to detect, then it's sort of missed its mark as far as that went.
Yeah, it's an interesting experience, Sand and Stars, for me. I listened to, despite the heat, I listened to every band with my wife, and I didn't have a score, I'll be honest. But one thing that really took me about the winners was the percussion section. They were just phenomenal. But not having the score, I couldn't see that, and I couldn't detect whether it was right or wrong or indifferent. Even if I had a score, I don't think I'd have known.
And that is a key thing. If we're reaching the point where you can't detect if it's right or wrong straight away, then again, how are we going beyond the point with what we're asking bands to perform?
This raises another interesting point, Grezzy, about percussion, which is that for some of the pieces we've had, particularly at the Open in recent years, and again, I'm not having a pop at Martin and Karen and any of that, because I think they do a great job running a wonderful contest. But some of the pieces that have kind of filtered down from the European level to the blockbuster own choice piece have got so much virtuoso percussion in it. You basically need 5 pro standard players, conservatoire standard players. Now, if there's let's say there's 20 bands in the Open, that means you need 100 pro standard players registered with bands in order to get through the contest on the day. Yeah. If you then use the same piece for the Grand Shield the following year, you've then got to find another 100 pro standard percussionists able to play the piece on the day that are not already registered with bands who are in the British Open Pyramid. If you then set one of those pieces for the area, you've got to find, and I'm doing the maths in my head here quickly, 400 potentially pro standard percussionists that are able to play. So when we're talking about what's a championship section piece, again, the word championship section means multiple things in this country in a way it perhaps doesn't in Switzerland and Norway, because there's only 12 bands, so they only need 60 pro-level percussionists for them all to play an incredibly technical piece. That doesn't apply in this country.
It's a really good point, Andrew.
And even getting the equipment, just to pick up on the end of that.
Correct.
The amount of pieces that we've had recently which have got a marimba in it. How many bands actually own a marimba? How many have got space in the band room for a marimba?
Wiggates have got one and we never used it. Wiggates have got one, we never used it. In all the time we were there, it got played once. And we did, what's the Tchaikovsky-based thing? What's it called? Extreme Makeover. The Extreme Makeover, the Johan de Meyer piece. We did that in a concert, and we got the marimba out for that. And as far as I know, in all the time I was there, that was the only time it was actually used. We had this $5.5 worth of marimba sat there doing nothing. But either the hire companies do a roaring trade, or bands end up spending a fortune on instruments they're never going to use again.
Or the opposite of that is that you hit the situation that we were in at the area where we had a marimba part, and we had a player who'd had to practice that on a xylophone and didn't see the marimba until the day because we just couldn't get one. We can't afford one.
Right. See, I'm sat here looking. I've got a score for the Lost Circle, the British Open piece, and I've talked to loads of people who are involved in it now. And yeah, let's call a spade a spade. They're talking about it, especially things like the percussion. There's a timp part in which, in part, looks like a xylophone part to me. Honestly. And I wonder, I don't know what we're trying to prove to anybody with this. And some of the other stuff in that score, I've heard conductors already discussing this, about this piece. I just don't know how I don't know where some of these, they sound a bit generic, some of these pieces, and they all seem to have to try to put in the same sort of stuff all the time. As far as the writing's concerned, it has to include certain things. It's getting higher and higher. But some of the scoring is just, I don't think it's making good use of instruments. Grezzy, you had a look at the bass parts in that.
I did.
And well, you tell them.
It's just, there's some of the octave playing and stuff. I like to think that that's done through choice and stuff like that, but it's just monotonous, absolutely monotonous all the way. To be honest, guys, I think we've gone down a musical cul-de-sac, and the name of this cul-de-sac is called nonsense.
Well, you see, we are getting to the stage where I think some of the really great pieces that we have in the repertoire. I noticed a while ago, I saw a list that Eddie Gregson, the top 10 or 20 pieces of the last 50 years, right, of brass band music, including anything. There was pieces in there like Energy, Robert Simpson, stuff like that. Now, if someone, the composer of the caliber of Eddie Gregson is saying that, what do we do with the likes of Energy now? Would bands just think that didn't contain the sort of language or statements that they would consider hard enough? Because I don't know if you've ever been involved in performances of Energy. It's a bloody nightmare.
It's the stuff of nightmares, that piece.
Yeah. I've studied the score of it. I've never actually had the pleasure of playing it, but I tell you what it would do. It would terrify an awful lot of conductors.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
An awful lot of conductors, because that controlled accelerando that you've got to do is really hard.
So I just wondered about pieces like that, whether they are we ever going to use them again? Those sort of pieces, or are we down this rabbit hole now with this sort of generic? I want to say BS, but it just seems that we're getting, it's just nonsense stuff that.
You're asking us, Andy, but you're in charge of picking pieces, aren't you?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, but it's
get it picked.
See, I'll tell you another little story. I talked to someone recently who was involved in a youth band course abroad, and they said that there's some stunning playing going on from these youngsters, but it's all based on, and I hate using the word, like I said, this technical stuff, fast stuff. The phrase I was given was, most of them can't carry a tune in a wheelbarrow.
Do you know that's a really good point, actually, Sandy, because you just mentioned that, and it's I think Simon will back me up on this one because we were in the band room together. I was in a band once where we were a good band at playing higher, faster, louder sort of pieces, and we had a pretty good success at entertainment contests and that kind of thing as well. And Simon came down to take a rehearsal, and in front of us, one of the pieces that he put out was Eric Ball's arrangement of All in the April Evening, and we couldn't play it. And it wasn't just bad, it was awful.
Yeah.
But when you looked at the other stuff that was in the pad, you looked at the amount of black notes that there were on front of it. We made a pretty reasonable fist of it, but we couldn't play together. We couldn't shape a phrase together. And as you say, we couldn't carry a tune in a bucket.
And so we'd gone down that route, the blind alley of pursuing ever greater technical dexterity, and we'd sacrificed everything that made brass bands great in the first place, which is the sound we make, which is the way that we can communicate with an audience, the way we can pull on the heartstrings, and we absolutely couldn't do that.
Why is it
real shock to the system?
Why has it happened? Why has that? Why have we got to this situation?
Well, I think there's certain pieces being championed by some of the very best brass bands in the country that are very shallow, very easy conducting, and
Are you talking about what concert stuff?
yeah,
Yeah,
but it all comes from there, and these things in these sort of pieces give you a real, oh wow, that was fantastic. But really, them pieces are so shallow, it's unbelievable.
I'm going to chip in here and make myself potentially horrendously unpopular with the brass band conducting fraternity, and I'm going to blame this quite solidly on the closed shop that we have in brass band conducting. And it's got worse. It was always a bit of a closed shop, but we now have an almost complete suite of conductors right through the championship section who are dyed-in-the-wool career brass banders and have not done things outside of brass banding. Whereas we used to have people like Howard Snell, James Watson, Elgar Howarth, people like that, who were Ivor James, who were coming in, Andy Berryman.
Yeah.
They've gone away and they've done other things. They've worked with other composers. They've worked with other ensembles. They've gone and played orchestral music and dance band music and big band and jazz and, weird, nutty contemporary stuff, and brought all that experience back to bear on brass banding.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't happen now. So what happens now, I'm afraid, is that a lot of our conductors like pieces that are easy to conduct but hard to play. So they might be in 4 in the bar, but they're full of semiquavers.
Or easy to conduct and sound hard to play. Because I know a lot of these pieces aren't hard to play, and but they do sound hard.
Yes, they sound impressive. Right. So you kind of guarantee the standing ovation at the end because you've played something that the audience, potentially not brass band cognoscenti, not experts, not people who want to hear slow playing or whatever. They hear something loud and fast and impressive, and they stand on their feet and they give you a big cheer, and you think, right, job done, I've sorted. I've arrived as a conductor.
Yeah, just to interrupt there, Andy. I remember who I would think he would fall into this category that you've just been on about. And I was discussing about some, I don't know if it was an arrangement I'd done, something slow, or just something else, a slow piece. It was something on it wasn't Elegy from a Downley Suite, but it was something like that. And said, it'd be great to play. He says, I can't really afford to play many pieces that end quietly. Even the slow ones have to have a big ending because you get better applause then.
Really?
Yeah. And I thought, God, how shallow is that? I mean, Grezzy, you and I talk nearly every morning, don't we?
Yeah.
Both on our way to our workplaces. And I keep saying, I'll often say, I heard this piece last night on the radio, or this, that, and the other, or, whatever it happens to be. And I heard some great orchestral stuff last weekend. New stuff. It was on Radio 3 Saturday morning. They've got a good magazine program on there now. It's actually pretty interesting. And I thought, God, that sounds great. That was great. It was interesting. It was different. It was so unusual. And I never once thought, and I've said this to you, I never thought, bloody hell, that clarinet part was sky high, and it had, a million demi-semiquavers in it, or the bassoon part was rock hard. It was right down in the bottom, the depths, honking about. And I never listened to music like that. I never listened to rock music, big bands, anything with that in mind. It's just good music.
Can you imagine
that?
If the BBC thought, right, let's feature some brass bands. Mr. Brass Bands, can you tell us what the latest sort of repertoire's like? And then we present it. Can you imagine what they're going to think?
I think they've probably done that already.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
they must have done.
That's why bands aren't broadcast on the radio, I think.
I think you've... Go on.
Just to pick up on a couple of points that a few people have made there. If we take on Mr. Baker's point about the fact that most of our our conductors are career brass band conductors now. So they're looking for pieces that sound hard but are quite simple to conduct. Let's not beat about the bush. Quite a lot of the time, it's the own choice section at the Europeans that provides us that sort of repertoire, and we get a lot of pieces that come through of that style from that competition. So going back to where we started this conversation right at the start, are we sure that going to a model where we allow brass bands and own choice as part of the national championships of Great Britain would be a positive step if this is the kind of repertoire that we're going to get out of that?
That's interesting.
That depends what question you're answering with what, because one of the questions we were talking about earlier on is how do you get bands from this country more competitive with the bands from Norway and Switzerland in the European.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to do that is to have them having that two-leg competition. But I do absolutely take the point that it opens the door to people commissioning pieces where a conductor says to a composer, I've got a really good, cornet player and a youth player, and they'll play any ridiculous silly notes you put in front of them. That's what I want.
Yeah.
I mean, you write me a piece, tell them, and I don't want anything that's in 7/16 or any of that. I want it nice and easy to conduct, but I want it to sound flashy. Away you go.
See, just going back to the Lost Circle piece, the one for the Open, and again, there's lots of talk going around already, and we know this sort of stuff happens on a very, very regular basis, especially with one or two bands. There are bands having the whole thing rebarred, the whole score rebarred to make it simpler. So
you can kind of see why that sort of thing happens, though. I mean, you go back to orchestral pieces. You look at the Rite of Spring, there's Stravinsky. There's that section in it that's like 3/8, 5/8, 7/4, 3/8, and it's it's sort of a bit nightmarish to look at as well. But the reason he's written it that way is because there's a real heavy accent at the start of every bar. So musically, it has to be written that way in order for it to make sense from start to finish. Now, it's we're getting a bit conspiracy theorist at this point, but we've all seen the section of St. Magnus that in the middle of it when somebody said, oh, it's not hard enough. So he's rebarred it all into 5/8, 3/4, 5/16, 7/8, and that kind of thing. And when you take it out, originally it's all just in 3/4. And I think it works out that there's like one semi-quaver difference or something at the end of it. So why would you not rewrite that? And more to the point, if you're writing a test piece for a brass band, why would you bar it in such a way or put your accidentals in such a way? Because the grammar of accidentals is one of my absolute bugbears. Why would you do it in such a way just to make it obstructive to read it if it undermines the music? And is it really right to criticise bands for rewriting it if it's been done that way? I don't think so.
That was all brought about by the European to make scores look more difficult than they actually were. Even altering the staff on the manuscript, it's just all thrown about to try. It's smoke and mirrors, basically.
Well, I mean, we know for a fact. You only have to talk to some of the composers where they'll have a passage that may be written in 2/4, 2/4 with a 3/8 bar and a 5/8 bar and whatever else, and bars coming in and out all the time, 7/8s and stuff. And then the whole thing, and you know how quick it is. I mean, both Andrew and Andi are very good arrangers and composers. You can, at a flick of a button on Sibelius, you can change 2/4 into 4/8. You can change 3/8 into 3/16 and blah, 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 and all that. And all of a sudden, this score, and you're right, Grezzy, they are, a lot of this started with the own choice Europeans, so that the adjudicators are sat there with these scores, only hearing them for the first time, and they are designed to bamboozle the judges. And we know that some of that, this sort of reorganization of how the score looks. So instead of it saying solo cornet, rep, seconds, thirds, flugel, horns, all the way down, it starts, one baritone at the top, and an E flat bass, and then, two trombones, and then the bass trombones hidden in amongst the horns at the bottom. All of that sort of stuff that has gone on is only designed to do one thing, and that's to bamboozle the judges. And we know instances where these sort of scores, where all the instruments are mixed up, that people have had their own versions done on Sibelius, and they've just rejigged the scores to put it in normal score order.
But when the piece comes out the other end of that, because obviously that's the one that's gone to the adjudicator, it gets published that way. So
Yeah.
all of that then goes on to the bands that have to play it if it gets picked for an open or if it gets picked for an area or something like that.
Yeah, I know.
With all the stuff in it that just makes it really obstructive to read. I mean, one of the last pieces that I played that's in my opinion terrible for it. I played Brussels Requiem last time round, and there's so many places in that. One of my bugbears is there is usually a right way and a wrong way to write an accidental, even if you're writing atonally and that kind of thing. But there's so many places in that where you'll see something and you work it all out. And if you sit and break it down note by note, it's a simple scale. But because all the accidentals are written backwards, usually descending in sharps or ascending in flats, and the leading notes are completely disregarded, it's just unreadable.
I mean, it is deliberate, though, isn't it? I mean, but
It has to be. It's never been easier to get it right because we have music notation software. There's even a plugin that you click on, it does it for you. So it must be deliberate.
Well, funny enough, you say that, but actually, natively, things like Sibelius are a bit rubbish at accidentals and voice leading and stuff. So you do have to know what you're doing and go through it afterwards and put it right. And I suspect that part of the problem is that people don't. And there's certainly no editing applied to pieces anymore. You know,
I'm saying is getting to be a lost art. Yeah,
it really is. It really is. And the other thing that I would argue is an issue now is that when these big pieces started coming out, these kind of blockbuster pieces, as you say, the slightly oddball score order and all sorts of 7/16 and 9/16 and all kind of stuff going on like that. Young composers would hear these pieces and think, well, that sounds impressive. And the way you learn as a young composer is you get hold of scores of things that you like, and you think, how's he done that? How's that composer written that piece? And you go through and you sort of pick it apart and you look at the bits that this is the bit, this is how I want to model my music. This is the way I want to learn to write. And people are learning to write based on published scores that are, in some cases, not up to snuff, unfortunately. And the other thing, I'm going to throw this in because this is an absolute bugbear of mine, and it's a personal one, so you'll have to forgive me, is that as far as I'm aware, there's no higher education institution in the UK now teaching brass band scoring at all. Because Huddersfield has now stopped, because I was teaching that course, and it was killed last year for financial reasons, because they said there weren't enough students who wanted to do it. Now I know for a fact there were 10 that wanted to do it. The people who were the module leaders were mortified because it's still in the prospectus. They're still telling people they can come and do it as a course at Huddersfield, but it's not. It's not offered anymore, as far as I know. They were also going to cut the brass band and the wind band, but there was such an uproar and a rebellion about that they were going to lose students if they did that.
God, yeah,
that's where music education is in the higher education sector at the minute.
Exactly. I mean, I did teach those modules years ago as well, Andrew. And there was always plenty. There was the scoring module and there was an arranging module, which came after that. And there was always a lot of students wanted to do it.
Yeah.
It's see all of these sort of things that we're on about, these sort of tricks of the trade sort of thing, rescoring things, having things, rewritten. Does it all just point towards it's all about Emperor's New Clothes, that we're pretending that we're really good at I don't know what. I mean, this technical sort of rubbish that we're churning out. But it doesn't actually mean anything. I mean, this is why going back to this idea of, I mean, it worries me that we have no access now to what we would call the sort of, the mainstream arts. Or there's no cultural interest in brass bands, and I think some of that might be because, like we said, if they say, "Okay, show us what you're up to," either on the contest platform or in the concert hall, and if you play some of the stuff that's getting played at the moment and being championed as being, the sort of cutting edge, these are what our top bands are doing. It's nonsense. It's just not very good music. Is it any wonder that we can't get a foothold back into arts festivals and the BBC properly?
This is a conversation I've had. It won't surprise you to learn with Eddie Gregson a few times about the composers that are writing for brass band now. And I'll include myself in this. Are not of the standard that in the past they have been. You know, we do not have Elgar, Holst, and Howells writing for brass band. We do not have McCabe and Bourgeois and Bliss and Robert Simpson. You know, people who would be on Composer of the Week on Radio 3.
Yeah.
We don't have those sort of people writing for brass bands anymore. But there's also what we have are banders writing for brass band, writing the sort of things that they enjoy playing and they want to hear and they think sound impressive.
We do, Andrew. You know, this goes back to what you were saying about career musical directors. We've lost bringing in to conduct our best bands people from outside brass bands.
Yes.
You know, your Gary Howarth, your Howard Snells, your James Watsons. That's why we've lost it, because we've stopped doing it.
But we've made a rod for our own back as well by the fact that these pieces that we're talking about here have generally led to bands being successful in the major competitions in the Europeans. I mean, you mentioned John McCabe a minute ago. There's nothing else in the repertoire I've ever heard that's like Cloudcatcher Fells. Could you turn up with a piece that was written along those lines, something as different, something as strange and ethereal as that, and put that on as your own choice at the European and expect to succeed, however brilliant a piece of music it is? Because, let's say, we made a rod for our own back because now everybody's doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, the only chance there is of hearing that piece again is something like is it being a set test piece, which again I think that would cause huge problems for some bands.
It's a wonderful, wonderful piece of music, but it tests you out and it changes the way that you have to play as a band, the way that you have to approach it. The same way that you mentioned contest music earlier on. Contest music is fiendishly difficult. It's just one of those things. I can't remember who it was told me that you can learn everything there is to know in it in 10 minutes, but getting it right will take you the rest of your life. Just because every time you think you know it, it catches you out. But that's part of the brilliance of what it is. It doesn't need a million semiquavers an hour to be utterly superb. Cloudcatcher Fells is a little bit the same. It's bizarre and ethereal, and you have to have a totally different approach to the music. The pieces that we're talking about, they just all need the same approach. They all need the same, play as fast as you can kind of thing.
There was a comment I saw on Facebook about 6 months ago. I can't remember what the discussion was, but there was somebody and who I respect. He's based in North Yorkshire, and he had heard a comment at a band he was conducting saying that this player considered contest music to be a second section piece. Now, the reason for that is because it's like Andrew said before, and Andy, but it's not a piece that's flying round. It's a touch. It's a control piece and all that. And a lot of people don't see the difficulty in that because they never really have to do it very much these days. They're far more comfortable bashing away in a click, whatever this is, in 2/4 or 3/8, doesn't matter. People who write that sort of stuff and think it's going to be difficult. Well, we all know that once it's sussed out, that's it, automatic pilot. But they much rather do that, and they consider that hard, but they don't consider. Well, I was going to say the second movement of contest, maybe the first movement, just the same. The control needed for that.
I'd love to give a few of those bands pageantry and see what they make of it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's out of the same mould of it doesn't, there's not zillions of notes flying around, but my word, it's hard.
It's the shape of it. But again, going back to this thing, I never listen to any other genre of music the way that I'm expected to be impressed by the sort of stuff that's written in test pieces. I never, ever have that experience. I never think, wow, that was a, fiendishly difficult viola part, and how impressive it was. It's just part of the music, but
it never comes across your mind, does it? You just want to enjoy the music.
Yeah, or I mean, I know I've been on a lot to you, Grezzy, recently about, Jacob Collier and people like that. I mean, he's just an absolute freak in nature. But I listened to something he did recently, Little Blue. It's from the Mahogany session. He says it's about 5 or 6 minutes long, and you got goosebumps on the arms now thinking about it. And there's more music in that than in these 20-minute test pieces, because it's real music. I keep coming across stuff on YouTube by accident, totally unknown to me, this stuff, and you think, God almighty, this is just fantastic music making of whatever genre. You know, there's a big band, the 8-bit big band, they do video game music, arrangements of that. It's absolutely spectacularly brilliant.
That's one of the things. It's just making its way through video game music. People sort of my age and things. You listen to some of the early ones where they only had little 8-bit synths and things, and you listen to the way that they had to make music work with very, very limited resources. It's really clever stuff. Yeah. So I think it's great that that's sort of finding its way out into other arrangements and things now. So because it's so clever, I'm not sure that these pieces that we're talking about that are causing the problem, I'm not sure any of them are especially clever.
What's interesting, and kind of just to kind of branch out a little bit and talk about composers that were, you know, on this topic of us being a slightly closed shop. One of my favourite bits of video game music, and I'm not an avid gamer, certainly not kind of in the way that Mr. Cook is, but one of my favourite bits of video game music is one called Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which is absolutely glorious. If you get a chance to look it up on YouTube, but it's set in the 80s in kind of middle England, you know, sort of Cotswold, Shropshire, and this village is deserted, and you've got to find your way around the village and work out where everybody's gone. And it's all very mysterious and a bit Twilight Zone. And it looks amazing, but the music is by a composer called Jessica Curry, and it's fabulous. It's just absolutely beautiful. It's all kind of strings and sopranos and so on. And then she went on to write some stuff for the Brass Festival at Durham. I think it was called Durham Hymns Project. Can't remember exactly what it was, but she loved it. She was well up for it, and she'd be delighted to write more brass band music, but nobody's ever asked her. Because I emailed her, I wanted to arrange some of the music from Everybody's Gone to the Rapture for brass band. And she said, I'd love you to, but you've got to ask Sony because they own the copyright, and Sony just never replied to me. Yeah, they never replied to any of my emails, so that didn't happen. But she said in the email she would love to do more brass band stuff, but never gets asked.
See, Andrew, don't you think that some of the problem with that is that if you're a band, and let's face it, the commissions for big contests now are few and far between, and some of them tend to seem to be shared between various band associations across Europe. So you might get 3 or 4 of them chipping in to get one piece. If you were going to ask someone like that, or Thomas Addis, or there's lots of other people who sort of spring to mind. What you've got to be sure of is that you will put up with whatever they come up with as a piece, and inevitably it will not fit this constricted template that we're stuck in for a big test piece. And we all know what that means. You know, it's the big flashy opening. You've already mentioned about the 5s against 6s against 7s. You know, we've seen that umpteen times. I've played loads of pieces like that. And you just think, well, you can get away with murder here. You know, there is no way to distinguish it. But if you have a composer who is just writing a piece of music and being left to their own devices, you know, to be fair, someone springs to mind, Stephen Roberts. I know he's written some band stuff, especially the things where he's sort of pastiching or using things like Scheherazade or stuff like that when he did the Arabian Nights piece. I've heard Stephen Roberts' orchestral music from years ago, and I've spoken to him about this when we've adjudicated, and he was astonished that I've still got cassette tapes of some of this stuff. And it's great. It's modern and it's different. But by his own admission, he can't write like that for brass band because it doesn't tick all the boxes that is expected to tick for it to be considered as a test piece, you know. And is this where it falls down with the likes of the BBC, or, you know, they'll not listen to the sort of stuff that we're doing for test pieces because they just don't think it's any good.
Well, we've had this problem before, haven't we? I mean, think about in my lifetime, think about the reception that Prague got when Judith Bingham was asked to write that. I think possibly we're a bit too conservative with a small C as far as that goes. We get as Grezzy said a minute ago, we go down our cul-de-sacs and no, this is the way we've gone and that kind of thing. And going back even further, think about the criticism that Spectrum got when Vinter wrote that. And that's turned into one of our absolute finest, the jewels in the crown of brass band repertoire.
It's worth pointing out that a lot of the pieces that were originally, they've got some notoriety for being poorly received as test pieces. So John McCabe's Images, everybody hated that when that was a test piece.
Great piece.
It is, yeah. Prague, I'm a big fan of Prague, but that wasn't written as a test piece. That was written as a BBC commission, I think. But it was a concert piece. Paganini Variations wasn't commissioned as a test piece. It was commissioned for Grimesthorpe to play at a festival.
It's an absolutely wonderful piece of music. I mean, the advantage, I guess what we're saying is that maybe we're looking at it the wrong way. We're asking people to write test pieces rather than write pieces of music.
I think so. I absolutely think so.
Do you think Cloudcatcher Fells were written for a contest? I can't see that in a million years, but what a beautiful piece of music.
That's wonderful. And again,
I think it was. I think it was commissioned for the 85 Nationals. But
he obviously didn't have the shackles on him then.
No, he didn't. But the thing with the Nationals in the 80s, and they commissioned a bunch of great pieces. I mean, the New Jerusalem was a great piece. I don't know whether, I can't remember whether they commissioned it. No, they didn't. That was National Youth Band. But there was a whole Bally for Band. Great piece, Dances and Arias. What a great! I know it's not Andy Cook's favourite, but I think Dances and Arias is brilliant.
We're allowed to like what we like.
Oh yeah, but
I'll not argue.
The reason those pieces happened in that era is because Boozy and Hawks were funding the Nationals, and if it made a loss, it made a loss. Now we're not in that position. If the Nationals makes a loss and Capitals goes bust, the National Championship dies, and we can't afford that to happen. So in the days when external agencies were paying for our banding, which I think some of us have not realised that those days have gone, but they have, we used to be able to have pieces like that as test pieces because it didn't matter if the audience hated it or the bands hated it because it was all paid for. Obviously Boozy and Hawks band festivals didn't want to take a big kick in on the Albert Hall not being full, but back in the 80s it generally was full.
Yeah, it was.
I remember when I started banding, I had my first Nationals in the lower sections in London. People would go and queue up outside the Albert Hall for returns.
You used to have a ticket touts occasionally.
Yeah,
they would have ticket touts.
I've used them.
And now they can't fill it. Can't fill it. So they can't commission a risky piece. And I understand that because of the economics of it. They've got to have something set for that contest that will put bums on seats and ensure that it survives another year.
It's strange you mentioned about these different styles of pieces. I don't know if it was you I was talking to, Grezzy, or it might have been Morgan during the week that's just gone. And we rattled off. We were talking about test pieces and blah, blah, blah.
I know what you're going to say with me.
Was it you?
Yeah.
And we mentioned, I think some of them with that Andrew's just mentioned there, Energy, Bally for Band, Cloudcatcher Fells, all these Blitz, all these different different styles of pieces.
And then you slip in Bally for Band.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but they're so different in their style. Do we get that? Do we get that change of style now in test pieces, or do they all just sound the same? Or is it me? Just they all sound very. It's almost like they're scared stiff of really expressing themselves, or
Well, I the best one recently for me has been Fraternity, but I sat there not far from you, Sandy, and listened all day. I actually played with one of the bands, and the way I was alarmed that the MDs didn't know how to connect with that piece emotionally.
Yes, absolutely agreed. So I'll tell you the one band that I think played that piece perfectly on that day, and they didn't win, and it was Foden's, and that's because they were conducted by Bramwell Tovey, and he got absolutely to the heart of that piece. And I mean, on the day I was in a slightly fragile state because my mum had passed away just the week before, but that had me in tears. His performance of that absolutely had me in tears, in a good way, I should emphasise as well.
It was real
just absolutely, and he didn't win. I don't know why, but musically for me, it was on a different level to everybody else that day.
Yeah.
See, again, go on. You're talking there about Bram Tovey. These guys, him and the Gary Howards of the world and Howard Snells, they're on a different level. We're talking about people with this vast, open-minded experience of music. we've lost that. We've just lost that.
One of my first contest experiences, and you mentioned him, was Coventry Variations, which Bram Tovey wrote originally just as a piece of music, and sort of extended it, put an extra couple of movements in the middle of it in order to extend it out as a test piece. But again, what we're talking about is he wrote a piece of music. He didn't set out to write a test piece, and the bits that he spliced into it, they actually work really quite well, because he's a proper clever musician. In its original form, it's maybe a bit more concise. But again, it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of music.
It is.
So whether it's a good test piece or not, I still listen to that. That's on my iPod.
Yeah.
One of the musicians that I feel we're in danger of missing out on slightly, and he's a former, I think, a euphonium player, is Martin Brabbins, who was until recently musical director of English National Opera. And I think he adjudicated at the Open on World Rejoicing. I think.
Right.
I might be corrected on that, but he's passionate about brass bands. Absolutely, a huge fan. But the opportunities to get him, because he doesn't want to come and just take somebody to a contest. But how do we get somebody like that involved in banding and bringing fresh ideas and a new perspective to things that's not just the same stuff that we always do?
I really do, and I wish I had access to ask these people in places of authority in the BBC and stuff. Is go to them and ask them why don't you play brass band stuff? They do, okay. I mean, Radio 3 plays brass band music. They have a brass slot every morning, but they're only talking little pieces. They played my arrangement of Eric Whittaker's Sleep a couple of weeks ago on a morning about 7 o'clock or something. That's fine for what it is, but why are they not interested in bigger pieces?
They've been playing a lot of Philip stuff as well from the World's Most Beautiful Melodies.
Right. I mean,
there's a bit of a common denominator, Sandy. They're all slower pieces, more heartfelt pieces.
Yeah, maybe. I would just like to ask them, what would it take? What would it take for you to get brass bands, get our top bands on Radio 3 regularly? What would it take? What sort of repertoire would you want? And what sort of repertoire, maybe more to the point, is would you like them to avoid? Because I think there's a lot of that. And again, is it tied up to what Andrew's mentioning about these brass band career conductors that are on a very narrow pathway? I mean, I've been lucky enough to have quite a close relationship with Gary Howarth at times, and just picking his brains and chatting to him about things and playing under his baton and things. You just think this man's on a different planet than most banders.
Slightly left field, but we've probably got to appeal. I mean, if you go down the Radio 3 route, that's obviously, having spoken to Andy Baker in the past as well, the art music route, and being able to find other musicians from other disciplines and such like who can push us in different directions and write us different types of music. That's definitely something that we absolutely have to try and get into. We have to try and make ourselves relevant as well. But one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Sandy, was about finding, people doing cover versions and playing different things in different styles on YouTube and breaking out there. And just, again, going slightly left field, the biggest response that I've ever had from an audience who have nothing invested in brass banding whatsoever was marching down the street with Chav Brass, playing club music, playing dance music, and just all club tunes, party tunes, that kind of thing as well, stuff that people will be dancing to in nightclubs. And honestly, I've never had a response like it. It was a little bit frightening the first time it happened. So is that maybe something that we can explore as well? Because brass bands have always done popular music. We've always done popular arrangements. I mean, you've succeeded with it with the tubular brass thing that you did, going out and bringing tubular bells, because you didn't get a brass band audience. You got a Matt Oldfield audience listening to them.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, the amount of people that came up afterwards, and they were obviously of an age that I was. I always used to introduce that half of the concert, saying that I grew up with this piece. Mike Oldfield wrote this when he was 17-year-old. I was I was younger, obviously younger. I would have been about 13 when it came out. But the people that came up and says, God, yeah, this, I grew up with this, I did, and all this. And there were people of my age who came to, they'd never go to a brass band concert. Why would they? And we got standing ovations and all sorts, and it worked because it was just the sort of left field thing. I would just like to see, I don't know how it happens. I don't know where the money comes from. I don't know. I would love to see some proper commissioning from somewhere for proper real composers, top names like Andrew's mentioned, to write pieces and say, not interested in a test piece, not interested in having a bloody phoneme cadenza or a soprano part that goes up to top E's or a bass part that goes down to bottom F, Z flat. I'm not interested in that. Just you write us a 10-minute piece, 12-minute piece, whatever else, anything. Just write us what you feel. Because I think those pieces, you would get far better music for that.
Get something different, at least. That's the key thing. We're seeing a lot of repertoire come out that's, as you said, it's very, very similar. It all sounds the same. It ticks all the boxes. It fills in the formula. And we can understand why that's happening, as Andy Baker's mentioned about the financial constraints. But how long can we keep doing that?
We can't. We're just going to be... I mean, it was John Fletcher, the tuba player, Philip Jones, tuba player, LSO tuba player, who said years ago, tuba music's written by tuba players for tuba players to listen to and all that sort of thing. And that's about it, and that's where we are. That's about where we're at, I think.
Yeah.
And I would just love to hear some of these, people who've never thought about writing for band, and they could be helped. There are lots of people who know how to score properly for bands if they need a bit of a hand with it. But write a piece, but don't make it a bloody test piece. But where do we get the outlets for it? How do we get bands more back into all these, the South Bank and the festivals and the BBC and more at the proms? I mean, what the piece that Gavin wrote for Treeger last year with the orchestra was brilliant. I thought that was fantastic. And Shed did another late night prom as well, which I thought was great. But I don't know how we entice the sort of the wider musical world, the sort of classical's the wrong word, but that sort of audience.
For me, it comes down to the people conducting the bands, because there used to be external agencies that would to a certain extent push us in that direction. So the BBC would commission a piece for Bandstand, and then they'd get Bessie's or Gus or somebody to come and play it for it. Yeah. Right? Or Boozy and Hogs band festivals would commission a piece for the Nationals, and if you wanted to go to the Nationals, you had to play that piece whether you liked it or not. It didn't really matter. And because it was the Nationals and it was the 1980s and people would turn up. So those outside agencies are not there anymore. It comes down to individual conductors with individual bands. But because we've got this, as I've sort of mentioned before, this slightly closed shop of people who are brass banders, and many of them do have musical experience outside brass banding, but their main focus of their work throughout their career has been brass banding. Yeah. We don't have that sort of external outlook. The one sort of exception I'd make to that is actually Ian Porteous at Tredegar, who I think has done some phenomenal stuff in kind of reaching out to the wider arts community, and particularly getting Gavin involved with the band and doing a lot of work with him. Yeah. I mean, Gavin's piece for the Europeans, So Spoke Albion, is just gorgeous. I mean, it's hard, but it's not hard for hard's sake. And the slow movement of it is just absolutely beautiful. In terms of proper slow playing, the guy gets it. He understands that there needs to be a melody and a kind of harmonic structure to it, and some warmth to the job, not just flying around the valves for 20 minutes. It's like being some of the pieces you use, it's like being smashed in the face with an arbon for 20 minutes, and it's just not fun. But that, Gavin really gets it. So kind of Ian's one of the people I would say, as a conductor of a band, understands the need to drive the band to engage with people outside of banding. But a lot of our conductors don't. They're happy to stay in the banding bubble, and we'll do our concerts to band supporters, and we'll do the contests that we always do, and we'll do the CDs that we'll sell to supporters, and they'll buy it because it's got our name on.
I think you're right.
Doesn't really drive the cause of banding any further forward in the way that Howard Snell did or James Watson. I mean, James Watson was an absolute powerhouse of getting people involved, getting stuff out. I mean, he pretty much organised a Black Dyke tour to New York on his own. For God's sake.
He was a guy that, Grezzy, we've talked about this before on here about Jim Watson, who we both knew to some extent. You probably better than I. I did play with him at Dyke for a bit, and the sort of stuff he was doing during his tenure at Dyke and before that with Deptford, he was playing proper stuff.
He was.
He used the concert repertoire to big stuff all the time in concerts, regardless. All that Walton stuff he had arranged by Ed Watson, and he used to play, a Downland Suite, and all the ones that Andrew mentioned before, the Elgar Holes stuff, Howells, Bliss, all that stuff. He was forever playing that in normal concerts.
He was
championing proper music, but he seems to have been sort of almost, I don't know if you say deliberately sidelined, but it's hardly anybody either seems to know about it or even cares that,
James Watson, he seems to have been rubbed out somewhat, which is a real shame because what a guy he was to play for. I remember I was only a young lad at Brighouse and they brought in Ray Premrue's Divertimento. And it was all new to me. I was like, wow, this is just stunning. The difference. But it was proper music. And but he never forgot the brass band classics. He used to rehearse them and put them on concerts and never afraid to give a proper concert of proper music.
I'll tell you what it might be interesting, Grezzy, to do is ask people if, when this comes out, to comment or to write in about who are the composers they would like to see who haven't written for band before.
Yep.
Who they would like to see writing for band. And even with the caveat that, if they don't know about the idiosyncrasies of the scoring and stuff, there are plenty of people that can help them with that. But Carl David, it's a slightly different genre, but he did Galaxies and Ray Farr helped him with the scoring and all that sort of thing. There's no reason why something like that couldn't go on now.
Well, there's three of you on here now that could help him. Help anybody.
I did a bit of a recording project with Hammonds a couple of months ago. Well, I did one last week as well, helping out. They were recording some stuff. And Kirsty played a piece that was written for her by Nigel Hess. God, it was beautiful. A beautiful piece.
I'm glad you liked it because I scored that because Nigel didn't know how to score for brass band.
So there you go.
He said, "I'll write the piece, but you'll cornet in piano and somebody else can score it."
Yeah.
And they went, "Yeah, it's fine."
That's exactly what I mean. So that sort of scenario where you've got someone there who is a real composer. Let's put it that way. The guy writes. We all know what he does. Who would you encourage to write music? Andy, go on. Tell us, who would you have? Name us 2 or 3 people you would like to see have a bash at writing a piece for band and not a test piece.
It's a shame that I would have said Chick Corea, but the problem is he died last year.
Yeah.
I'd like somebody like that. One of the jazz heavyweights, just to push us in that direction.
Just talking about when we did the tubular brass thing, and we did the counterpart in the first half of that was the piece by Hannah Peel.
Oh, that was brilliant! I loved that.
That was
brilliant. Cassiopeia.
Yeah. And after that, we were trying to get. There was a guy called Johan Johansson, who writes loads of this weird sort of electronic stuff. He was a big soundtrack composer, and he had heard it all. He had heard that and Tube of the Bells and all that, and he was dead interested in writing. We were sort of in the beginnings of negotiations for doing something, and then he passed away. And that was and he was quite well known for doing what he did, but and you would have got something totally different there. He wouldn't have been writing test pieces and stuff.
Well, I'd love to get the guy who writes writes for Sigur Rós, the Icelandic band.
Oh yeah.
Because he knows how to turn a tune. He really does. And he's got that kind of almost the same sort of ethereal quality that Andy was talking about in Cloudcatcher Fells.
Yeah.
He just captures that really. I'd love him to have a go at writing something for a brass band.
Oh, I also did the orchestral arrangements for Nightwish. They're like a Norwegian symphonic metal band.
Right.
Whoever does the orchestral settings for them, they did an album with, I think it was the whole of the Oslo Orchestra or something like that, just called Once. And you listen to it, it's like fully symphonic. All the arrangements for that are amazing. Don't get me wrong, it's a heavy metal album, but the scoring for it's fabulous. It's the sort of thing you can lose yourself in.
Yeah. It's interesting. I would just love to get stuff that was a bit different.
Imagine if we could get Jacob Collier to do something.
Jesus. He never. I'm absolutely. I'm lost for words. There you go. With Jacob Collier.
Has anybody heard Danny Howard's trombone concerto that she wrote for Pete Moore? I think it was the Royal Philharmonic. She was composer in residence at either the London Philharmonic or the Royal Philharmonic. I can't remember which.
Right.
But the trombone concerto she wrote for Pete Moore is absolutely fabulous. What a piece. Yeah. It's great. And she also wrote a fanfare. I don't know if you saw, the Gavin Higgins concerto, the National Youth Band and the National Youth Orchestra did it recently.
Yeah, yeah.
And I went to the Liverpool performance of that. And at the start of the second half, before they did the orchestra did the Prokofiev Symphony, they did a fanfare that Danny Howard had written for all the orchestra brass and the National Youth Brass Band. So there was 50 odd brass players doing this fanfare, and that was great as well. It was only a short piece, but it was fabulous. Great to get Danny Howard to write something.
See, these are the sort of things I would like. The worst scenario I could think of would be to ask Danny Howard to write a test piece.
Yeah.
You've got to get these people to write what they want to write and not say it, because how many times, and I've heard this a lot, where you speak to guys in bands abroad who have had big own choice test pieces commissioned, and they'll get the first draft of it, and then they'll send it back and say, yeah, it's all right, but it's just not hard enough. Yeah, we need loads harder, much more technical, much more of this, higher, faster, louder. Because they think that's what's going to be required to compete in these contests. And these composers are going back and writing, they're sort of almost bastardizing their initial ideas. That's maybe unfair.
But then when you come out the end of that, it's the same old thing that we've just been discussing. It just goes down the cul-de-sac. It's us as bands that are pushing them in that direction.
Yeah, I know it is, but we are in a cul-de-sac with it, but because we can't afford. We talked at one of the earlier podcasts about having about Dyke playing Volcano at the European as an own choice, and it finished quietly, and it was almost a disaster. We did win the contest at the end of the day, but it's probably the last time, and that was a long time ago, that anybody has risked playing a quiet ending piece. For all its greatness, Devil in the Deep Blue Sea, Bourgeois, and how difficult it is, nobody would dare ever play that at the European for an own choice because of the ending, which is ridiculous.
You see, that's another thing, though, about Devil in the Deep Blue Sea, because, it's blistering difficult technically. And then once you've completely destroyed your face playing it, then you get the slow movement at the end of it as well. Exactly. Which is one of the reasons why it's so hard.
That's the tenor on solo, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember that.
It's what Andrew said there earlier on about Eddie's piece, and saying that there was nowhere to hide. There was no bluff and bluster and BS going on. You could hear everything clearly. You could tell whether the band was playing it or not. Yeah?
But
that's the same with Devil in the Deep Blue Sea.
I had a mate he listened to lots of orchestral music. He didn't listen to brass bands, so he asked me to put a CD of our stuff together for him. So I put, most of it was transcriptions of orchestral stuff on the end, and I threw on the Fairies recording that you guys played on of Devil in the Deep Blue Sea at the end. And the thing was, he was completely blown away by that piece. He absolutely loved it. And the thing is, I know that there's a certain school of thought in brass banding that completely disapproves of it.
but it got through to him because musically it all made sense and it was the sort of thing that he could latch onto. I mean, can we say that about the sort of pieces that we're dealing with now? I mean, Sand and Stars that we were talking about earlier, that paints a lot of pictures and it gives a lot of atmosphere when it's played well. So musically, I suppose it can communicate at that level. But some of the other stuff that we've had to play would just go. Somebody who didn't know brass banding and didn't know brass band test pieces, it would just completely pass them by. And the key thing that I've always took away is that I gave this guy Devil in the Deep Blue Sea and it didn't pass him by. He heard it and thought, that's brilliant. Why have I never heard this before?
Right.
Okay, guys, that's all for this week from Smith and Grezzy. It's been absolutely fantastic to have Andrew Baker and Andy Cook along with us. I certainly enjoyed it. Did you, Sandy?
Yeah, I thought it was great. I was hoping it was going to be like the way it's gone tonight on this, but it surpassed what I was expecting as well. I think you've got some really interesting stuff out of that, and I just hope that if people are have enough interest, maybe to chip in with the discussion and tell us what they've thought about what we've talked about, and maybe give us some more ideas, because I would certainly like to get these two guys back on for more of a talk in the future about other things.
Okay, so that's all for this week on Smith and Grezzy. We'll see you again soon.